Okay, I think if everyone is ready, we should get the ball rolling. And welcome, everyone. This is part of the China-Australia Writing Center 4th International Symposium. And this is our final and most looked forward event called Creative Conversation. And this has been our fourth or third Creative Conversation. Like it is an annual event, sometimes held, 1 year it was held in Fremantle, Australia, in Perth, and the next year it will come to Fudan, Shanghai. So today we will have two panels to be broken into there will be a 10 minutes break between the panels. So I have the honor to introduce our very distinguished guest speakers and also moderator. Our first panel moderator is Dr. Lucas Klein, who is a translator, scholar, and also assistant professor from the Hong Kong University. Lucas Klein. And this is Eleanor Goodman, who's a poet, translator herself, and from scholar, research associate from Harvard University. And then sitting on my very right is Mr. Chuan, who is one of the most celebrated Chinese contemporary poets, as I think you have all read or know his name. And this is Dr. Michael Farrell, who is also a very famous Australian scholar, poet, and writer, now residing temporarily in Shanghai. So I look forward very much to the discussion this afternoon. So I'll now pass the ball to Lucas Klein.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here. I have a whole bunch of questions for the three of you, sort of circulating around in my head, sort of buzzing a little bit. I think it's the questions that are buzzing. Maybe I was listening to some speaker last night that was too loud, and maybe that's what the buzzing is. but I guess hopefully what we can do is I don't want this to be just a sort of a sequence of interviews where I ask each of you, and then that's one question, and then that's it, and I ask the other one. Hopefully we can open this up, have a bit of a dialogue here. I can be looking in both ways. I'm the one whose head has to be, I guess Michael's head has to be, swiveling a little bit too. But why don't we start it off? I would like to, Michael said that he wanted to read something, a poem of his own to get us started off. So would you like to just open that way? You can read, and then maybe we can talk about that for a little bit. How would that work? We have a microphone here.
I thought I'd read this poem because of it's a polylingual poem and involves an amount of translation. It also will have some European accents, so I apologise for those, or for my rendition of them. Motherlog. Whenever I start a narrative poem, she says, God, 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 so you can take that for granted. I'm editing her responses. This is the yarn of, well, you'll recognise it, and imagine her with her hands over her ears as she does the washing up with her elbows, I suppose. After my third, there was a swan and then a suckling pig. I'd find myself hanging out clothes in my underwear, or my husband's, and the neighbours drawing the blinds at each other, saying, she's not really adjusting to Warunga, is she? They, inside my own house, have eaten me a hole in the couch, and I'm doing the accounts with one hand and killing a snake with another, while I get an armful of wood. But after a few wines and a few accidental discounts at work, I have an online business, I'm ready for joint family suicide, one of our TV games. God, 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 adding rhythm. Then the eldest comes in with blood on his face from fighting with some pimble trash and says we're out of water. So I gather up the tribe, 1 or 2 boys, 1 or 2 girls, the swan and the suckling pig, and we head towards the Linfield Reservoir, each of us with the biggest water vessel we can carry. Then there's a shift in critique. She's saying, you can't, meaning I can't, tell a woman's story. But I am telling it. Mariah, named after the wind, not the singer, has crawled into a crocodile. And I didn't even know they had crocodiles on the North Shore. But I'm only a girl from Nimtabel with a horde of kids of one kind or another walking the edge of the road, wine bottles in hand, playing sweet, sweet music with their little breaths. The swan gets in after her, and I wouldn't want to be a crocodile on the other end of a swan. I think the swan left a torn Coke can in the crock for good measure. And Mariah comes out all slimy and beaming with some sorry overbred excuse for a Wurunga hound, saying, "Mummy, look, I found a puppy," and I say, "Hooray, what are you going to feed it on?" But there's a crow eating a possum as we turn the corner, and Mariah's got her waddy, so she shoos the crow on the head and puts it in her dilly bag and sets the little socialite with its faux diamond collars kisser in the pre-pecked possum. Animal cruelty? Examples to children? I hear over the lino vacuuming. Bush rules, I say. It's starting to get dark, and as I'm new to this built-up area, only having recently moved here from Belconnen, it seems very strange and eerie. The houses here truly have no season, no blossom, and the lawns have no smell. I had a couple of cones earlier, and a slight feeling of paranoia begins to resurface. But as anyone who thought of it would say, you can't drink paranoia, let alone have a bubble bath in it or boil spuds. So we head on, but I'm glad I brought my shotgun. The kids and co are all wearing their scapulars too. So when the devil rides up on a horse, I'm terrified but stand my ground. "Nice little herd of pigs you got," he says, stroking the dead lamb in his lap. He broke into my consciousness with that one, I said to Trent later. "I'll give you a water bag for the boy," he said, not pointing at my oldest, but at Jess, my androgynous third. And I said, "No deal. Give us a billy out of the good of your heart," I said. And while I waited on his reply, I chanted, "Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee." And he said, "Nema etson citrom aro nitik nan," which sounds like nothing, but I soon realised was the Ave Maria in backwards Latin. And I said in forward Spanish, "Dios te salva Maria, llena eres de gracia." And the devil replied, "Nema etrom atson aled arolon osida," in backwards Italian. So I said, grabbing the billy by the handle as I did so and mentally thanking the Portuguese nun I'd studied with, "Ave Maria, cheia de graça, o Señor é contigo." And he grabbed the handle too with his bony hand like Voss, come out of the desert to steal my children, my honeybees, muttering in his best, better backwards French accent, "Nema trom eton ed erul te niem." I shot half his head off then, yelling, fit to rouse the Nazis from their master chefs in hell. "Gegruset sest du, Maria, volle Gnade, der Herr ist mit dir." I knew I was out of languages, and I could tell he was ready with backwards Tagalog. Jess gave me his saw, and I cut off the devil's fingers and took the billy. It was a diabolical billy and never emptied. So we threw our bottles into the bushes and headed home, thinking that Trent would probably be back from the bank by now. Steeds of Satan, they were faster than lightning, and we got home an hour earlier than we'd left. So I decided not to smoke the second time round, gave Mariah a pot to cook the stew in, the crow in, and did some journaling. It looked like we could make ourselves at home in Wurunga after all. I can hear exaggerated yawning from the bedroom, so I'll leave the story there, put the garbage out and the kettle on, and go into the love of my life. My witchety's at half-mast already. Bon voyage, nuit.
That was really something to hear. That was amazing. So I presume that the reason that you thought to read that was the backwards Latin and Tagalog and so on. Am I right?
Yeah. 'Cause I used Google Translate a few times.
Did they have backwards Latin as one of the options? Or?
No, well, I did that manually.
Oh, okay. Is there more about the poem that you'd like to say, to explain something about where it's coming from, where you think it's going, or where you hope it's going?
Yeah, I mean, last night we were talking about Australian words that you may not know the meaning of if you're not Australian. There were
a few, yeah.
There were a few in that poem as well, probably. Like Billy is a kind of generally improvised can for making tea or carrying water. what else? Anything? What comes to mind? The suburbs are kind of mainly Aboriginal words, but they're Sydney suburbs, so it's partly. I like to kind of like take cracks at Sydney sometimes, just for the fun of it, even though I love it. And it's particularly taking cracks at North Shore suburbs, which means where rich people live on the water. And I suppose, like there's something about my Catholic upbringing is pouring out into this story about encountering the devil, but it's also drawing on colonial trope of running out of water. So the main joke is that you're in this rich suburb, you've just moved there, and you've run out of water, and you've got to go on some trek to find it.
But in the writing about something rather local, something that uses Australian vocabulary or that deals with Sydney suburbs, North Shore suburbs, and things that Australian readers may be familiar with, but international readers may not be able to catch up with. At the same time as you're dealing with other languages and that kind of interchange, that sort of dialogue, whether they're translated via Google or whatever, or maybe even spoken backwards by the devil, you have a mixture here of localism and some sort of international kind of ism meeting together in the poem. So I guess we'll go from there and we can open it up. Maybe I want to hear what both Chuan and Eleanor have to say about that. So I guess we'll start with Eleanor, because Chuan looks a little too surprised. So I'll.
So I was actually struck by your delivery, which in an odd way reminded me of Sichuan's delivery of some of his poetry. I mean, Sichuan can also be an incredibly funny writer, but he has a very understated kind of humor in his delivery. He often reads it just completely straight, and it's something absolutely hilarious that's, and the audience is rolling. So I'm curious about how is that typical of how you read, and what is that relationship to the humor that's throughout that entire poem?
I think it is kind of typical. I like to kind of let the jokes slide under the audience's skin, I suppose. I've also read that poem quite a few times, so I've probably become more kind of, I don't know, I mean, sort of more down, low key, but also probably in a way more nuanced, because if you're not, the less rhetorical in a sense you read, the more that you can play with line breaks or with little meanings within that, little intonations that point to particular things, and different, over time, different points of a poem will seem interesting that day, that you want to kind of point to in some slight way. Yeah.
You just dodged my question completely. I'm going to give the microphone back to you. You're not going to turn it off this time. And oh, can I repeat the question? Sure. I wanted to sort of open up the conversation, although, if we have more to say about reading styles and so on, that's probably okay too. But I wanted to ask about, the relationship between internationalism and localism, different languages or more sort of local or regional kind of vocabulary in writing, maybe in translating. If you have a thought on how these things, can come together, should come together, don't come together. Or,
Okay, I won't dodge. Sorry, I won't dodge it this time. I'm very aware of my writing language and my translating language as a contemporary American vernacular. So, and those are my readers. I have an American audience primarily, but that doesn't mean that there aren't people reading these books who, for whom that is not, their natural speech. When I read literature that comes from elsewhere, a different kind of English, I find it incredibly exciting to encounter things that I don't know. I think it's an enrichment. And as Michael points out, we have Google. We have Google Translate if we need it. And so it's an opportunity when you encounter something that you don't know to learn about it, to discover it. And I think, I mean, I know this is true for you as well. You know, if you're a writer and a translator, you are fascinated by language, and you're fascinated by the, you know, different manifestations it can take. And it's, you know, it's been exciting actually, you know, in this course of this conference, to hear words that I genuinely did not know and could not guess at the meaning just from the context. Australian English really is very different from American English. And it's, you know, it's really cool to kind of be exposed to these different, you know, ways of speaking. I know, you know, Josephine Wilson is here, and she'll be speaking next. I just recently read her amazing novel, Extinctions, and there is a particular moment in it where one of the main characters, the husband, is remembering a scene where his wife is cutting capsicum. And I read that and I thought, okay, I think that means pepper, I think. And so in the American edition, they actually changed that, which I think is a shame. I think it's really fascinating to encounter these moments of estrangement from your own mother tongue.
Do you have anything you want to add, Sichuan, to estrangement from your mother tongue, or you know, regional sort of vocabulary, international, other languages coming into the poem? Do you have?
Well, before I came here, actually, I went to, there was a meeting at the Beijing Normal University, and the Chinese novelist, his name is Jia Pinghua, was there. And there was a discussion about Jia Pinhua's prose works. And then Jia Pinghua gave a short speech. And then I heard his accent from Xi'an, from Shanxi province. And because, well, usually in Beijing, we speak the Putonghua, or is that Beijing dialect? There's no such a saying, right? Just Putonghua. Okay,
Right,
Mandarin.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's quite rare for a person in Beijing to speak in Shanxi dialect, and but Jia Pinghua just spoke like that, and I felt that he's quite proud of his accent, and then I feel that I'm a person living in Beijing, and I speak just with the Beijing accent, and I feel that I'm in want of that accent. So sometimes I feel that it will be better that I can know other dialects. So it could be interesting that you have one text and with different words from different cultures, from different areas, and but for me, sometimes I feel that I'm quite poor in having these different dialects. But I also make some combinations or mixtures of, for instance, very colloquial words. But sometimes I use for instance, in a sentence, that's a colloquial sentence. But sometimes I may just want to go astray, to use a strange word sometimes, and yeah, sometimes I do that, and I don't know, to create a kind of atmosphere in my text.
Do you feel like using stranger kind of vocabulary is something that is? I guess what I want to ask is, what do you think the relationship is between using sort of stranger vocabulary in Chinese, and then also ways that, you know, other parts of the world, other countries might come into your poetry, other countries' languages might come into your poetry. You know, whether you know, you as a translator as well, or a poet who's, you know, always reading other kinds of translations. Is there a relationship here between those kinds of things?
Well, since I'm writing here in China, and here there's the cultural atmosphere. I think the cultural atmosphere here in China is quite different from Australia, from the United States. And in China, if you go to the internet, you may find people, they always give criticizes for those people who use words from translations. And there's I can't say there is a strong what's that? Strong ideas, or the ordinary. I mean the ordinary people. If you use many words from other cultures, people will criticize you, saying that you need to follow the tradition or something like that. So here in China, actually, the factor of tradition is, I have to say, it's quite strong. And so for a period of time, I mean, in 1980s, 1990s, I was criticized. People said that you're trying to use a tone which is not a typical Chinese tone. But of course, I don't care about that, because I think modern Chinese, the language, actually was influenced by translations. So starting from the early of the 20th century, writers started to use some translation, some words translated into Chinese. So there are elements from other countries, and yes, I myself is also a translator. So I sometimes just mix them up. I do lots of things, like what's that? Cross borders. I think Michael also does that all the time. From this area, jump to the other area. So from this language to another language. Yeah, I think that's a kind of linguistic adventure. I love all kinds of these linguistic adventures.
That's a great way of putting it, linguistic adventures. And still, to my mind anyway, leading off of the moments of Michael's poem that are the multilingualism and so on, some of what you said, Sichuan and crossing borders, reminds me of, Eleanor, you read a poem yesterday from your book where you said, this is, if I'm remembering correctly, you said you're trying to write a poem that was like the experience of reading a poem in Chinese. Can you talk about that more? I think you have your book here. If you want to read it, you're welcome to.
English poem and like Chinese. Sounds like Chinese. Is that?
No.
No.
Well, I'll read it, and then I'll talk about it briefly. So it's called Swimming Lesson. Swimming lesson. On top of your body, propped on rocks by the shale promontory and shadow of the lighthouse with its implications too obvious to limn, where foam gathered and broke in the kelp with spits and sprays, the sea growing ever more greedy, and these are still your environs, despite the estrangement, your dark eyes darkened by my questions, closed with the divided heat of your body beneath me. I looked out to where there was no land, beyond, to that imagined harbor, and the island of thirst-easing olives and fished-skin fruits you promise without meaning to show me, and thought of what it would take to make it, how far out I could swim on my own if I leapt. So I also really love the idea of a linguistic adventure. I think that's just a really brilliant way of thinking about it. So in that poem, I'm trying to take people, my readers, on the kind of adventure that I experience when I'm reading frequently, when I'm reading a Chinese poem in Chinese for the first time. Frequently, I can't follow contemporary Chinese poetry sometimes uses punctuation in the way that we would in the West, but frequently doesn't. They will use punctuation in a different way than the way we would punctuate a sentence in the West, or sometimes they leave it out entirely, which, you know, of course, we experiment all over the place in English language poetry also, but it's this very distinctive characteristic of contemporary Chinese poetry. So when I'm reading, I frequently don't know where the sentences start and stop. I don't know what connects to what else. And, you know, I think Chinese poets are wonderfully adept at playing with grammatical structure so as to surprise. So, you know, the second line recasts the meaning of the first line. So that's I'm trying to replicate in some way in that poem that feeling of being off kilter. We don't have the text, so you can't see how I've lineated it, but I've done things with the line breaks also to try to produce that sense of disorientation, but also, I hope, you know, adventure.
So, I guess one of the things that I mean, I've heard you tell that story a few times, and I really enjoy hearing it. But one thing that comes to mind now, just hearing this, is that, you know, if you feel like there are things that you are learning from contemporary Chinese poetry that you're translating, and that stylistically that they can be so different, and that it really takes effort on your part to write that way in English, and effort and artistry and attention and attentiveness to write that way in English, then that means that, you know, at a very fundamental level, there are really big differences between, you know, Chinese poetry and English language poetry today, which makes me wonder about the criticisms. I mean, I'm very familiar with these kind of criticisms too. That, oh, you're not writing in a Chinese way. You know, I ever heard someone say, oh, these poets, they don't know how to eat rice and noodles anymore because they're eating too much bread. You know, you know, sort of metaphorically speaking, they're not Chinese enough. And I mean, it's kind of a ridiculous notion. Most Chinese poets I know eat plenty of rice and noodles, but also, you know, even though they're, you know, Chinese poetry and English language poetries are the result of, you know, border crossings and linguistic adventures, they also still have their styles that seem to me that do make them pretty unique, and that make translation still necessary, because it's not like we're only reading the same things. And so I guess to come back to you, Michael, what are some ways in which you feel like Australian poetry, you know, is or is not unique? Can you have a stab at answering that?
Well, I think partly in that it kind of, maybe not completely unique, but I think it is, is highly informed by English and North American poetry in a way that, so that in a way you could say has the advantage on those poetries which aren't informed by Australian poetry, and maybe not each other as much as Australian poetry is. But I mean, certainly I think that's in the air, that kind of idea of whether new Australian poets, because I think, like with new Australian poets, you know, over generations, they're always doing something that's not quite what the previous generation did, and then it doesn't fit in with the schema that's sort of at least unconsciously mapped out in critics or commentators' minds. And I think, but in some ways I think my own poetry became a lot more Australian as I grew older and more experienced, and was more comfortable in letting kind of my natural language come out, because I grew up in the country. There's a lot of words in there that other Australian poets would probably know what they meant, but they may not feel comfortable with using them because they're kind of more country words rather than city words, and it's more country culture. Were telling me before, you've written about Australian literary history and 19th century Australian poetry. Can you say more about that? Yeah, I mean, it's in a way it's not exactly poetry, but it's kind of like a conceptual framing of a lot of early life writing in a way to try and say that, you know, interesting or exciting or experimental Australian writing in English doesn't begin with the 40s or the 60s or the 80s of the 1940s, 60s, 80s, that there are lots of really interesting texts from the 19th century, including 19th century and early 20th century, including indigenous texts and even a Chinese text, which I talked about at the last talk. And it's sort of what I'm really interested in there. I mean, partly what I'm really interested in there is what happens to English writing when people are writing for the first time. So there are people coming to English, the Chinese man, the Aboriginal writers are coming to English and they're writing this coming, but there's also like illiterate people who are either dictating or they're also coming to writing for the first time, and they may not have if they or their convict parents had stayed in Britain or whatever. So I think it's kind of like there's some kind of invention that's going on, and that's what I wanted to oppose against the idea that English or Europeans came to Australia and they just kept going.
So there's a level at which you're digging into, your own cultures and your own poetry's history to try to re-narrate things in a different way, and in some ways, argue against, sort of staid notions or accepted notions. Chuan, you recently published your book on Tang poetry, which, as I understand, has been pretty well received. Can you and that's another sort of area, especially if you're talking about Chinese poetry. Tang poetry is exalted and often looked at with awe, but often looked at with maybe too much simplicity. Can you say something about your reading of Tang poetry and how that, just of your reading of Tang poetry and what you're trying to do there?
So we have a very famous book edited in Qing Dynasty, which is called 300 Tang Poems. And I think there are several versions of that book in English. But meanwhile, we have another book which is called Complete Tang Poetry. And Complete Tang Poetry consists of 50,000, almost 50,000 Tang poems. So 300 poems out of 50,000 Tang poems, it means something. And the ordinary Chinese readers, usually when they talk about Tang poetry, their knowledge is usually that's from the 300 Tang poems from that book. That's a brilliant selection, I should say. But then, but something interesting coming from reading the 300 Tang poems is that by and by people got a kind of cliche in talking about Tang poetry. For instance, poems needs to be beautiful, needs to be elegant, and they talked about the way of living, so people can follow the Tang poets, and the poems were easy to be understood, and they are the poems were so people can recite the poems, and we have a form which is called 绝句. So 绝句 usually 4 lines. So many people can recite some 绝句from this form of poetry from the Tang Dynasty. But I feel that we have right now. I mean, we have lots of misunderstandings of Tang poetry. First of all, our taste for Tang poetry, we got that from Qing Dynasty. That's not from Tang Dynasty. Qing Dynasty started from the year 1664, and the book 300 Tang poetry was edited in which year? I can't remember which year, but that's at the time of Qianlong, late Qianlong period of time. So actually, that's
in the 19th century. that right?
Sorry?
Qiang was in the 19th.
No, earlier than that. It could be 18th century, early 18th century, something like that. So when the Chinese talking right now, when they talk about Tang poetry, actually they talked about Tang poetry according to their Qing dynasty taste for poetry. That's it's a problem. I think it's a problem, and the Tang poets. It's up to an issue of classics. So when we read classics, we always read them without noticing the surroundings, the social and political surroundings of these works. For instance, when people recite a poem from Tang Dynasty, they never imagine how the poem were written. So how, for instance, Li Bai, when Li Bai or Li Po wrote a poem, he needs to write. He needed to write line by line, character by character. But now we just forget that, and we take poems for granted that they are great. They are great. They are ready written. They are great, and we need to recite them, and we need to follow them. For a poet living in this society, then I realized that I have words character by character, line by line, and I have my concerns, I have my feelings, and sometimes I'm happy, and sometimes I'm upset, and I'm annoyed all the time. So how to put these things into sentences? That's the same thing the Tang poets did in Tang Dynasty, but there's a difference. Usually, if you read lots of poems from Tang Dynasty, actually, you have ways, a kind of, I don't know whether it's a correct term or not. That's an agricultural way of writing. And now in Shanghai, people live here, and Shanghai people, Shanghainese, is that word? Shanghainese. Okay. A Shanghainese, when a Shanghainese starts to write a poem, then suddenly his language, his or her language, allows him or her to write about the nature, but not the city itself. We don't have good ways to write about the skyscrapers. That's new life, but we don't have, we have words, but we don't have words proper for poetry. So it's a problem, and this is just the landscape of the city. If you go to the political issues, other cultural issues, the economic issues, then we need to. So we may find as a poet we have lots of difficulties. So poets needs to be brave. Poets needs to be brave in writing, not only in a sense of in just now I mentioned in economic issues, political issues. You need to be brave in language issues, and that's a test actually for the poets, for contemporary Chinese poets, from contemporary Shanghainese poets, and of course Beijing poets.
So, okay, so we've heard, Michael talk a bit about his research and Chuan talk about his research. I'm going to turn to you, Eleanor, because you told me that you have a lot of anxiety and mixed feelings and so on about the idea, about the question of research. So I'm going to ask you then about research and how you understand, as a research associate, as your business card states, what's the relationship then between, for you in research and poetry and maybe in translation?
I don't think I used the word anxiety, actually, but I do feel some anxiety about it. So I would be really hard-pressed to talk about research in the context of my own poetry. I'm not a poet who writes I think from a sort of research angle, I think my poetry comes much more from things that I experience directly, either within the world or within the world of my own mind and emotions. But where the anxiety, I think, does reside is that and I think this is different in a Chinese context, but in an American context, translation is not taken very seriously. It's not thought of as involving any research at all. It's not credited in a university system as work, which is shocking. Because, and I know this is true about you also, there is a tremendous amount of research that goes into translating any given poem, let alone a book of poetry. You know, you're constantly trying to figure out what is the context of this poem? What is the vernacular of this poem? What is this word refer to exactly? And that is a really deep kind of research. So maybe it's less, anxiety and more frustration that translation really isn't thought of in those terms. There are lots of other frustrations, involving how translations are received or not received in the States. And I'm very curious actually about Australia and how that's looked at there and how that, that works. But certainly in an American context, translation I think is sort of thought of like, it's busy work in a certain sense. It's like you just look at the word and then you write it on the page and you look at another word and you write it on the page and it's just, it's just like, it's something mechanical. We have this odd idea that it's sort of, and that it can be done by machines, I can't tell you how many times I've been told, oh, you better find a new profession because, Google Translate is going to, and I find it very hard to believe that Google Translate will, or something like it, will ever get to the stage where it can translate poetry. I'm confident it will be able to translate, set kinds of documents, economic documents or legal documents, things where there's a template. But I think it takes a human being to provide the level of interpretation that translation needs. So anyway, so that's all just to say that I do a tremendous amount of research, but it's not looked at as such in the American context. What, Michael, do you have something? I'm really genuinely curious about that
I don't
situation.
know too much exactly, but I mean, I think that if anything, translation probably has a lower status or than in the US. I don't know, or maybe it's quite similar, just because there is that thing about the dominance of English and other languages aren't really needed. So,
Are Australians curious? Like, do they enjoy reading translations? Because that's part of the problem in the States is that, we tend to look at translations with suspicion because they're not the real thing, and we don't really know how to approach them as both original texts and texts that have a source text.
I think it probably just depends a lot on the writer and what kind of push they're getting, or what kind of, if they're being noticed as, like Roberto Bolaño or someone like that becomes, the novelist du jour or whatever, and then the fact that they wrote in another language, I think, probably just disappears for the most part.
I think it's about time to open this up to questions from the audience. Let's do that. I see one hand raised. Do we have other questions? Okay, I'll get a few first. So you raise your hand first, and then we'll go to the young woman next to you, and then we'll have over here.
I'd like to ask a question to Mr. Xi. Thank you. I'd like to ask a question to Mr. Xi Chuan. When you were explaining about the 300-tone poetry, as I'm Chinese, and then we were taught in school that those were actually popular lyric in the town contents. When the time passed, the music gone, the lyric lived. So that's what poetry as the rhyme comes up. So in the English context, sometimes could be hundreds of years ago, and also we know last year, the Nobel Literature Prizes go to Bob Dylan for those literature. So how those works?
It's a big question, I have to say, because other languages, English language, they never experienced a movement like us, like a May 4th movement, which took place in the year 1919. And after that, now we are speaking. It's not only an issue for poetry, it's also an issue for the language. We are now speaking modern Chinese. It means contemporary Chinese poetry has its linguistic environment that is modern Chinese instead of classical literary Chinese. So classical literary Chinese has a different music. I was told that the smallest unit of the language is characters in ancient Chinese time. But right now, the basic unit is words. So whenever we use words, usually 2 characters means 2 syllables, 3 characters, more than 2 characters. It means that we are using. Well, I need to be brave to say so, but it's the fact that we are using a language which is a little bit different from ancient Chinese literary Chinese actually. The music has changed. The rhythm is different, and so now I know some people, including myself, we sometimes rate poems according to ancient forms. At noontime, I talked with Lucas. Actually, recently I wrote some poems in ancient forms, but I know that's something different, quite different from my poems in modern Chinese, in vernacular Chinese. So it's a big issue that now the modern China, usually in other countries when people talk about China, people talk about ancient China. So they feel that, for instance, China from Qing Dynasty, from Ming Dynasty, from Tang Dynasty, that's real China. And people may feel that this contemporary China is a fake one, a fake China. But actually, it's also China, but it's modern China. I think this is a kind of I don't know. Whenever I meet foreign friends from other countries, when they talk about China, good China is always the ancient China, and contemporary or modern China, that's China with so many difficulties, darkness, and that's a living world. Actually, that's a living world. All living worlds have its darkness, and it's good to say so. But so I'm always alert to a kind of way of thinking that is, whenever I want to show that I'm a Chinese, then I need to pretend to be an ancient Chinese. Actually, the Chinese novels, films, I think poetry is good, but other arts, they have ways to entertain the international readers or audience. That is, try to show you that I know ancient Chinese landscape, the paintings and the music. And I've just come back from Spain. I went to a poetry festival there in Madrid, and when I went there, the organizer wanted to give me a musician to go with my reading, and they found a musician who can play ancient Chinese musical instrument. And I'm a contemporary poet, and I do lots of experimental things, and I try to follow the sometimes I do something. Well, for me that's interesting. And then with the guqin following me, I always feel embarrassed by this kind of performance, the Chinese performance in this world. I hate it, I have to say. Bob Dylan, I think they are qualifying to talk about Bob Dylan. I love Bob Dylan.
Next question here.
I was wondering, may I propose a question in Chinese because I have Chinese is my first language, and I have way better commandment of Chinese than with other languages. And could someone please translate it for me? Oh, thank you. 我是一名小说写手，然后呢，就是在我写作过程中吧，我遇到2大挑战，并且这2大挑战呢，就是我觉得很难克服，所以我希望您能够给我一个，如果可以，没关系，因为您写诗，我觉得可能这样吧，我就长话短说吧。首先第一就是语言环境。您刚才说的那个问题呢，其实我也体会到了，因为现代汉语的历史本来就不太长，100年左右吧，然后加上我是80后，然后加上就是我就感觉好这近10年，特别是或者说这近15年来，就我生活的这个语言环境是越来越糟糕。比如说我们现在有一些词汇哈，听起来很闪亮、很轻松、很时髦，但是仔细去感受它呢，它其实都很肤浅。比如说幸福感爆棚，人品差；比如说我的内心是崩溃的。就是别人在跟我说这些话的时候，其实首先我都没有一个，我都不知道怎么去往下接。这样的词就是他把话说得很满，所以就是我担心我长期生活在这样的环境里面，其实最终让我没有办法，就是我的语言就不好。我的汉语是我母语，但是很糟糕的是，我的汉语是用来，我发现我的汉语是用来交流的。如果是写的话，写小说哈，写小说那我得写长一点是吧？然后只要一写长，有时候我写到300-500字，我就发现我开始重复，所以这个挑战其实很大。
So the question is very simple. I'm a novel writer. And then my first question to Mr. Chuan is that in current context, the Chinese language, because I'm 80 after, so the language we are having, the modern Chinese, is with the history of only 100 years. And then nowadays, that in this context, I find out that lots of words has too much meaning that which is not as concise. And then, for example, several words like 幸福爆棚 means the happiness, full happiness. And other words, if I am as a writer who write 500 words, I find myself repeating myself a lot. So this is how.
我首先哈，就是我嫌别人写的不好，然后我自己又写不出来，然后呢，我又没有，就是我也没有一些很好的现代汉语写成的小说来学习，比如说像沈从文的，他的书是很好，但是我读他的时候吧，我就感觉我没法去学习，因为毕竟他跟我也隔了快80年了吧，就是这个语言，这是第一个问题，然后第二个问题就可能就，第二个问题现在要问吗？
我们先回答一个问题。
So to supplementing my first question that I'm reading and then trying to follow the example of the good writers such as Mr. Shen Chongwen that to follow his elegant words. But for me that I don't have such kind of like example teachers trying to write so elegant words.
First of all, 幸福感爆棚. I don't know how to translate it. I have full happiness. Is that the? Okay, so if I want to use it. This sentence in my poem. I may have something like that. Suddenly, a monkey stand in front of me, saying that I have a full happiness. So you need to. You may use it. Actually, whenever I came across this kind of sayings, I try to use them, but I try to use them in a strange way. I think, to be a good writer, you need to be alert to the changes in the society, including these things which you don't like them, but they may, if you are strong enough, actually you can turn them into the materials you need. So try to make good use of them. But you can't follow them. You can't just follow the mainstream of the language or mainstream of the ideas, but you need to make use of them. So that's my answer to this kind of cliches. I love cliches. And but to be a writer, you can't say, I should follow the cliches. I love cliches. Then how to use them? That's the answer. And also the works by Shen Congwen. Shen Congwen is a good writer, and meanwhile you may read other writers in translations, not only Chinese writers, other novelists from Australia. Yeah, try to read. If you are not satisfied with the works by Shen Congwen, try to read Australian writers. Okay.
Hi. Oh, there we go. I know that you had another question, but why don't we move on first, and we'll come back to you in a little bit, okay? Yeah, Josephine has a question.
Do I have to hold down something? No. Okay. I just have a question for Michael Farrell and for Sichuan. Michael, you spoke about as you became more confident and grew in your writing, you feel you've returned to the country, to landscapes and sounds and words that come from where you grew up. And this is an example maybe of the centre and the margin, which we've been, the country in Australia is marginal, I suppose, and more vernacular. And you spoke about Beijing as the centre, the unspoken sort of, it doesn't need to be different, it's the centre. And I wonder if you think that as you do develop your writing and become older, that you return, you become less interested in the international and the thinking about, say, the international reader, but maybe perhaps more interested in exploring your own earlier, those words that are closer to your beginnings because of the confidence. That's my question.
I think yes and no. I mean, I think that there's kind of like maybe like a series of returns in a way that you kind of like each time is like a bigger and broader return, and then you have a. I mean, I'm interested in. I'm still kind of like in a way the worldly or whatever, but trying to sort of like be able to get the more you understand how your little world of growing up is positioned in the world, as opposed to being its own world.
Is that a question or?
Did you want to clarify the question for Sichuan too?
I think, Michael, I think that's what I was interested in, this idea of becoming more local, if you like, and more confident in that language rather than kind of more globalised translation.
I mean, I like to use it as a bit of a kind of class weapon as well.
Poetry as a class weapon?
Or, language or culture. Yeah.
As class weapons?
Yeah.
Do you have anything to say about that, Sichuan?
Well, I live in Beijing, and if you go to Beijing, you may find lots of buildings, and we have cafes, and some people may feel in Beijing, wow, we are now living in a Western life. but that's Beijing. And for a period of time, Beijing, I mean the whole city, took New York as a model to develop. And then I think about the year 2000, the Beijing administration government changed its mind. Then they chose London or Paris to be models. That means they realized that they need to preserve some old houses. And it's for me, it's quite interesting. That is, in Beijing, sometimes you feel that you're very close to other parts of the world. But sometimes you feel that this is really Beijing. And if I ask Beijing, if I ask a question that is, where do Beijing looks like? You may hesitate a moment saying that maybe some parts of it, it's like New York or Chicago or maybe Sydney or any other places. But then it's such a big mass, such a big mixture. I think this is only Beijing. You can't find Beijing in other places. So in this way, I try to understand my living condition there in China, and it has connections of my understanding of the language I use.
Do we have other questions? No other questions, and we can come back to your second question.
我第二个问题呢，可能不好意思。
没事儿你就说，对，没问题，那个话题。
我第二个问题呢，就是可能如果让大家感到不舒服的话，我先道歉。就是关于主题，主题呢，我希望能够写一些永恒的主题，比如说死亡，死亡呢是人的必经之路。然后比如说人都渴望被爱，然后人渴望被尊重，然后渴望至真至诚的交流。然后就是我发现吧，我观察到就是80后或者90后的很多作家，他们很关心，当然我觉得这不一定是坏事哈。他们关心就是说我要娱乐，怎么好玩我怎么来，然后要开心，然后呢，就算是一种怎么说呢？就他们最多写的就是说，希望可能有时候希望坏人遭到报应，就是我们对，就是从我的生活出发吧，从我自己的观察出发，就是我们对这个永恒主题，但我不知道我说的永恒主题是不是别人认为的永恒主题，就对它的描述很少。我的困境呢，还就是我也没有人，就是没有人指导啊，或者说我没有，比如就是说写成的一些小说，我可以阅读的，可以来学习的，就是这方面的资源我很缺乏。
So the question was about how to find a topic that like an eternal topic or a topic with sorry. Motif. Subject matter, I think, is probably better than motif. Thanks. How to write it, with longevity or an eternal, a long-lasting kind of topic, subject matter. Is it okay? How about Michael answers the question?
I just want to say it's really refreshing to hear this question because it has to do with fiction. Usually we hear that question or kind of question in the context of poetry. It's really an interesting phenomenon in China that there's this sense that the finer arts, and I hear it all the time in the poetry world, as I said, that there's this kind of bloodlessness to it, that it has been kind of drained of meaning, that the language has been either used up or polluted or in some way made less significant. And I think that speaks, returning to anxiety, I think that speaks to a kind of anxiety that is there in the culture on many different levels about, kind of the contemporary condition. Do our lives have meaning? How do we find that meaning? Because I think really the question is not about how to write, how to find a subject matter, what to write about. The question is what to live for. Where internally is that subject matter? And I think it's a very general kind of concern. When I'm asked a question like that about China, which is sort of, I'm being asked obviously as from an outsider's perspective, I think that there are incredible layers of meaning everywhere. And as Sichuan does this beautifully. He says, I love cliches. And that's because he takes the cliche and recontextualizes it in this funny, some absurd, sometimes very poignant, but always extremely surprising way. And it is to make surprise out of something expected. Similarly, I think we can make meaning out of something that seems meaningless.
I think that was a great question. I'm sorry, a great answer. And a great question, too. That was a great answer. I'm looking at the time, and I see that we probably should be wrapping up soon. I know that there are there's a panel, another episode of the Creative Conversation coming soon. I don't want to eat into their time. Is there any last remarks that we want to have? Sichuan or Eleanor, anything else you want to add, Michael?
A few words to her question. That is, well, as a beginner of writers, you always follow something internal, the internal values and these things. But there's an American artist, his name is Jeff Quince, I think, is that Jeff Quince? Or maybe another person, I can't remember clearly, saying that, give me money and I can make you world famous for 15 minutes. Is that by
I think that was Warhol. I think that.
Oh, no, okay, yeah, Andy Warhol. Andy Warhol. So from this sentence, you may get something that is, it's the world has changed on the one level, okay, on one level. But now the Chinese young people, they talked about all these things that you've mentioned, but I think China is a secular society, and although we have some believers, religious believers, but the mainstream is a secular society, but there's just one thing that may grasp people, that is death. So no matter how rich I am, no matter how famous I am, no matter how powerful I am, no matter, I don't know, all people will die. We have the same end, actually. So although we don't have a religion for death, but actually all Chinese suffer from this. So you may find that people might be cynical to God, to all other, let's say, values, but all the people are serious for their own deaths. And then, so whenever people talk about ghosts, you may find in this society, that is, people seldom talk about God, but we always talk about ghosts. Why? Because all of us have this same end, that is death. But usually in daily lives, we try to, so we seldom talk about death directly, but we talk about ghosts. I think it means that the death is not far away from us. It follows us, and we can't escape from it. And so So it depends on you how to deal with this, how to deal with this picture of the society, and you may have a story, a very happy story, talking about ghosts and happy ghosts, and then something is still there. It could be interesting.
That's on the final note of happy ghosts. I think we'll just bring this conversation to a close. Please join me in saying thank you to our panelists. I had a great time with you.